We are iConnections, and it's time to talk about change. To work together and rebalance our global systems. To create a more equitable world for everyone. To celebrate women and their achievements. Acknowledge their trials and their triumphs. To challenge biases and recognize that the leadership of women is essential. We choose to invest in our future because equality is non-negotiable for investment. And change emerges from leadership. We must overcome discrimination, challenge gender inequality, and balance our responsibilities.
Every challenge comes with a choice.
I choose to challenge.
I choose to challenge.
We choose to challenge.
Welcome to our Fireside Chat with Professor Marissa King. This session is sponsored by BNY Mellon Pershing, a business-to-business provider of global financial solutions. BNY Mellon offers world-class resources with the personalized attention of a boutique. Our next guest, Marissa King, is the celebrated author of Social Chemistry, Decoding the Patterns of Human Connection. Marissa is a professor of organizational behavior at the Yale School of Management, where she developed and teaches a popular course titled Managing Strategic Networks. Over the past 15 years, she has studied how people's social networks evolve, what they look like, and why they are significant. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Bloomberg Businessweek, and many other prominent outlets. Speaking with Marissa today is the CEO of iConnections, Ron Biscardi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the next session of the iConnections International Women's Day event. We are joined today by Marissa King, author of Social Chemistry, Decoding the Patterns of Human Connection. Marissa, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here with you.
Yes, so I am super excited to talk to you about this subject because, as you know, iConnections is at the center of the alternative investment world. And our primary objective is to deliver a platform to this marketplace to help everyone connect with each other. So you are the first professor I've actually ever spoken to about human connections and how they come about and how we can get, I think, more intelligent at how to establish connections and really kind of build our networks more intelligently. So in reading your book, I was really fascinated at the underlying mechanics of it and really the science of it. So let's just jump right into it.
Fantastic.
So now you're you're a professor of organizational behavior at Yale. You've been doing research in this space for, I believe, 15 years or so. And your book is really interesting in that I feel like it shines a light on an area that we all have experience in, right? Like every human has experience establishing networks, creating networks, even though I think we're all doing it unintentionally, whether we realize it or not. One of the things that I found really interesting was how the vast majority of people are uncomfortable with the concept of intentionally creating a network for themselves. Even though we realize how important this is, pretty much no matter what you do in life, you know, the people you surround yourself with really have an impact. Can you start by just explaining what is the general resistance to intentionally creating a network? What's that all about?
Yeah, we know from a lot of research that almost 2/3 of professionals, even professionals whose entire business relies on engaging effectively in communities and cultivating relationships, even among that set of people, close to 2/3 of people report either being actively resistant or reluctant to the idea of thinking intentionally about their relationships and networks in particular. And there's a couple of reasons that this happens. So there are really three key reasons, and I'm happy to delve into each of these in turn. The first is simply that there's often a moral aversion or sense of like networking, this idea that networking really is dirty. The second piece is oftentimes people feel like they just didn't get the playbook, they didn't know how to do it. And the third reason is really time. And what I hope to show in my work is that really it's not spending more time, but investing that time in a much more intentional way that's critical. But before we get there, we first have to tackle this issue of like, why are people so resistant, as you mentioned, to this idea of being intentional about relationships? And this is really shown in a terrific study that was done by Tiziana Cacharo-Rotman, Francesca Gino at Harvard, and Miriam Kachaki. And in this study, what they were interested in is uncovering where this resistance comes from. And to do that, what they did is they asked people to recall a variety of different types of relationships. So some were spontaneous interactions. So I bumped into you, Ron, at the coffee shop, and we had a conversation, and it led to an interesting professional development. So you could think that is a spontaneous interaction. But they were particularly interested in this category of what they called instrumental professional relationships. Oftentimes what we think of when we're thinking about networking. So an instrumental professional relationship would be, for instance, going to a prototypical networking event. I'm at a business conference, I'm looking for a sales lead or looking for a new job. And when they ask people to recall that type of interaction in particular versus these more neutral types of interactions, the people who thought about this idea of professional networking in particular, when they were later given a word completion task, like show the letters W blank S H. If you think of those words, what comes to mind? People in this idea of thinking about professional networking in particular were twice as likely to think of words like wash instead of more neutral words like wish. They preferred cleaning products over more neutral products like Post-it notes. And at the heart of this is really this idea that it underlies moral psychology, right? That we like when we think of something that makes us feel dirty, we literally want to wash away our sins. And that's at the heart of capturing this idea of this moral aversion to this idea of thinking about our networks in an intentional way. So many people feel this, and it makes perfect sense, right? Our relationships are in many ways are one of the things that we hold most sacred. So being intentional about them or trying to profit from them or even, oh goodness, being strategic about them, right? It creates this sense of moral aversion or moral unease. Now, what's interesting is there's one group of people actually that don't experience this at all. And it turns out that it's people in power. And understanding why that's true is really helpful for starting to figure out how do you overcome this if you do experience it yourself. And what they found is that people in power don't experience this because they approach relationships thinking about what they have to give. And so if you can adopt that mindset about thinking about what can I give in a relationship instead of what can I get, that idea is really, really critical to overcoming this aversion to intentionality or instrumentality that many people think or have when they think about relationships.
What you're saying is that the people who've achieved a level of success, high levels of success in whatever their profession is, they're more likely to see the word wish than they are the word wash in that test, right?
Exactly, right? They just don't have this same sense of aversion to this idea of thinking about networking. And on the one hand, you could think like, oh, well, that makes perfect sense, right? They became powerful exactly because they know how to network. But even if you experimentally manipulate this, so you make people feel powerful or you put them in a position of power, the effect remains. And so the question then becomes, oftentimes people who are lacking power also will think, well, what do I have to give? But there are so many things that we all have to give, particularly in this moment. Reaching out this one, hey, I'm thinking about you. In many ways, that just connection is a gift. Asking for help also is in many ways a gift, particularly it allows the other person to feel a sense of mastery, a sense of accomplishment. Being of service is actually a gift that allows the other person to get outside themselves. So asking for help, giving help, even saying thank you, those are all gifts that we all can give to help overcome this moral aversion.
Yeah, I think it's funny in reading the book and some of this in particular, it really did bring me back to the early days of my career when I can remember walking into a room for a networking event or a cocktail party and just having this sense of dread as I walked into the room. It just was, oh, this is so brutal. I hate having to do this. And now, of course, many years later in my career and in an aspect of our industry that's very focused on introductions and having people meet each other for business reasons, it's I don't have that same experience anymore, but I get that it is really hard for people to walk into a room and feel like my purpose is to meet someone who's going to further my business agenda. Now I think later in your career you realize this is not a dirty thing, right? This is not, there's nothing wrong with this. This is how the world functions. And in fact, when you establish those relationships, you can do a lot of good for the people you're meeting, as well as hopefully experience some good on your end. Can we talk about the three groups that you identified? Putting, I guess it was, you're characterizing each person in terms of what kind of networker they are, or what kind of network they have. Can you tell us a little bit about that aspect of the book?
Absolutely. So if we think about our networks, right, in terms of shifting from networking to thinking about networks, right, we all have networks, really. Our networks are just our traces of interaction that we have, whether it's the momentary bumping into a barista in the morning when getting a coffee, or more enduring relationships with friends and family. And when people think of the benefits of their networks, whether it's personal benefits in terms of emotional support, decreasing feelings of loneliness, the professional benefits of our networks, getting a job, innovation, creativity, pay, promotion, all of those are tied to the characteristics of our networks. And oftentimes when people are thinking about networks, they're focused on how large their network is. But what we know from decades of research is it's actually not so much how many people you know, it's the structure of those connections, the patterns they make that really have strong predictive value. And so what we know from close to 3 decades of research in the social sciences is that most people's networks can be characterized as one of 3 types. They're either brokers, conveners, or expansionists. So we can go through a quiz. So I don't know what type you are, Ron, but we can try to figure it out. All right. So let's try to figure it out. So conveners, friends tend to be friends with one another. If you were having a barbecue and you invited 25 people that you know, or would most of them know each other?
Uh, yeah, I would say probably yes. Most would know each other.
So most would know each other. Do you like changing plans at the last minute, or do you not like changing plans at the last minute?
I'm constantly changing plans at the last minute.
All right. So what we know about conveners is so you have some characteristics that you may or may not be a convener. Conveners' defining characteristic is that their friends tend to be friends with one another. That's oftentimes because they've lived in the same place for a long period of time. They've had the same job for a long period of time. And they also tend to build these networks in part because they psychologically don't like unpredictability. They don't like change. And these convening networks are really safe. And that's one of the benefits, is that there's a lot of safety in a convening type network. There's a lot of trust. There's also a lot of reputational benefits. And it also helps provide more emotional support. So you may not be a convener. Anna Wintour is an example of someone who is a well-known convener. So we can think about, maybe you're the next, maybe you're a broker. Brokers' defining characteristics is they tend to straddle different social worlds. They may have spent a chunk of time in the marketing division, and they also frequently talk to people in sales. And normally those 2 functions wouldn't come together. And because they span those different worlds, they tend to be innovative and creative. So one question to ask yourself is, have you had an unusual career path?
Very. Yeah, my career path made absolutely no sense.
You may be a broker. Are you good at making impromptu speeches on things you know nothing about?
I mean, I'm doing this interview, so yeah, I'm going to go with yes.
It's perfect. You definitely have characteristics of a broker. I'm a broker. Hopefully I know something about this topic. I'm not just talking about things I don't know nothing about, but that characteristic, that ability to make impromptu speeches on things you know nothing about, it's an important characteristic of brokers. So if we think about their benefits are really innovation and creativity. They're in the idea import-export business. We know that most innovation comes through recombination, and brokers are particularly good at this because they talk to groups that normally wouldn't talk together. But that ability to also translate between them. So, right, this ability is called something that's known in the psychology literature as high self-monitoring. It's essentially a chameleon-like characteristic. And why that's so important is it allows them to be really effective translators. And what's interesting about this particular personality characteristic is usually if you ask people, what do you think is the most important personality characteristic for what type of network you have? Most people usually think about introversion, extroversion, but it turns out that explains very little variance on what type of network someone has. That this chameleon-like quality of high self-monitoring actually explains the vast majority in terms of which personality characteristics are important. Brokers' benefits are really strong. They tend to be innovative, they tend to be creative, they tend to have more work-life balance, but oftentimes they're at risk for reputational assassination or they're greeted with suspicion because of this chameleon-like characteristic.
Because people at some point realize they don't really know what they're talking about.
Or they suspect they don't, right? Like you're not really part of us. Do you really know? So there's this idea that they may be like discovered, right, as not as part of the group.
That's okay. And then the last one is expansionist, correct?
Yep. So the final type are expansionists. And expansionists have extraordinarily large networks. Most of us know on average between 650 and 900 people. This is our acquaintance network. But expansionists will know orders of magnitude more. So one of the ways of figuring out whether or not you're an expansionist is to ask how many people you know named Emily. And when thinking about if you know them, that you have seen them in the past 2 or 3 years.
4.
Oh my goodness.
I know 4 Emilys. My wife and daughter are both Emily, so maybe that doesn't count. Do I carve them out?
No, it's really important, but that's like a whole, we could get into this whole other characteristic about how we tend to, anyway, we tend to choose names in people who are with similar names in terms of marriage and all these things, but we'll set that aside for now. And how many people do you know named Adam?
At least 2.
So you're definitely an expansionist. And I think this is helpful because you can be in more than one category, right? You can be a broker and an expansionist. And so what I'm doing is I'm trying to figure out how big your network is. If you know one or so of one Emily and one Adam, you have a fairly average size network, but 2 or more, and you're well into the expansionist category. So the benefits of that, right, are popularity, visibility, and the opportunity to create large scale social influence and really change the way that people are thinking.
Interesting. So should we be striving for one of these 3, or is this just, it kind of is what it is? It's like I took a Myers-Briggs, it tells me this is who I am, that's just who I am, and then I maybe just work around that reality. Or can we intentionally try to strive for one of these 3?
So there's no one best or right network. It really depends on where you are in your career, for instance, or what your goals are in a given moment. So for instance, you take the career path example. We know that being an expansionist is actually particularly helpful early on in a career when you need access to new information and you need access to resources because you don't have them yourself. Brokerage is most advantageous mid-career. And then finally, one of the most difficult shifts that people have to make, because brokerage eventually becomes unwieldy. You can span 4, 5, or 6 different social worlds, but eventually it becomes quite unwieldy. So later in one's career, moving towards a more convening-like structure can be really helpful because there's a lot of trust that helps guard against loneliness, which is so endemic, particularly in the C-suite and beyond. So that's just one example. You can also think about your personal life, right? Do you need more emotional support at the moment, or would you benefit from meeting new people? And what's really important to realize is our networks aren't fixed. Some of it arises from our basic predispositions or preferences. But at the same time, arguably far more than personality or predisposition, it's really where are you spending your time in terms of physical location and how are you investing it? Are you trying to meet more new people, or are you focusing more on maintaining your existing set of social relationships? And behavior also influences all of this. For instance, conveners are great listeners. Brokers tend to be really good at framing and translating. And these are all behaviors that can be learned and adapted. So we can certainly change our networks to help meet our needs. And our networks are really constantly evolving. The key is that they're often evolving in an unintentional way. And so what I hope to do is to help people realize that by being much more intentional about your networks, you can bring much more value to yourself, but also others in your community.
Interesting. So how do you, how has COVID impacted all of this? Are you seeing a significant shift? I mean, one of the focuses of an upcoming event that we're doing in May, Funds for Minds, is a charity capital introduction event that we're going to run with a mental illness as the primary charitable focus of the event. And the reason we chose that is because so many people are struggling right now with loneliness in particular, as we're all so much more isolated than we used to be. Um, how do you navigate a pandemic, and how do we think about our networks and being intentional about this when we're all kind of stuck at home in a spot where all of this has just become much harder? Do you have any advice for us on the best way to go about it?
I appreciate that you guys are taking on this issue around mental health. And I think actually that's been one of the silver linings of COVID, is that the business community is actually starting to have conversations around mental health, particularly the issues around loneliness. And that change, I think, is something that could be really important moving forward, because even before the pandemic, we knew that there was an epidemic of loneliness. And part of this stemmed from a sense of loneliness or isolation at work. And what I've been doing in my own research is also investigating how has this changed during the pandemic. So in a study with my colleague Balash Kovacs and other collaborators, we investigated this issue, and we found that certainly loneliness has increased during the pandemic. That's not that surprising. One of the more interesting and surprising findings that we found is actually that our networks have shrunk by close to 15% during the pandemic. Well, what's even more was astonishing to me is about that finding is that reduction in network size is almost entirely due to a reduction in the size of men's networks. So men's networks have shrunk by close to 30%, or roughly 400 people during the pandemic. But women's networks have hardly shrunk at all. And I think that's also an instructive finding, and we can dig into why that's true, particularly if we think about focusing on International Women's Day. Like, why is that true? Particularly when women have faced so many difficulties during the pandemic, we know that it's not because they're spending more time on their relationships. Right? Women are far more, particularly working mothers, are far more time stressed than ever. So it's not that women are actually spending more time investing in their social relationships. It's really that they're investing it differently. And I think that that's a lesson we can all learn, right? The key is to think much more carefully about how we're connecting with other people, not just to try to spend more time doing it. And that's been really important for women to have fared so well during the pandemic in particular.
So what are men doing wrong? That's a gigantic difference between men and women's networks, 30% versus zero, effectively. What is it that men are doing that's had such a negative impact?
So I think that I feel like it's being a little hard. Like, I'm like, oh, it's not that they're doing something wrong, right? It's in part due to circumstance. So we know from research by Robin Dunbar and his colleagues that men tend to maintain social connection by doing things together. They may go to the gym together, they may play basketball together, they may go to the bar together, they bowl together, they do whatever men do together. And that's also true for how men maintain relationships with women. It's usually through shared activities. In contrast, women tend to maintain relationships primarily through conversation. And so men's ability to do things together has been interrupted during the pandemic, but women's ability to have conversations hasn't been. And so that explains part of this difference is just simply in the way that we stay connected with one another. The second piece is that women are actually far better at accurately recalling what their networks look like. So if I'm asking a woman versus a man to guess, if they're a broker, to be an expansionist, women tend to be better at this. They're also better at estimating network size. This is true not just of women, but it tends to be true of people lacking in power in general. And part of the reason this is true is they tend to be more empathic and they tend to be more sensitive to social signals, in part because they have to be. So, right, if you're a part of a socially excluded group, you have to understand how to work things in order to get things done. And so that ability to understand what your true network value is really important, particularly during this moment. This, like the kind of cliche saying, like out of sight, out of mind, is actually true. That if we forget how many people are in our network or the true value that's in our existing network, then those relationships become lost. And we know from a lot of different research that they're actually very rarely recovered. And so I think it's important, right? Whether you're a man or a woman, regardless of this, in power, out of power, to take home these two pieces, because if we continue particularly to work virtually, this isn't going away. So part of it is we need to figure out how to maintain relationships when we can't actually do things together. And the second piece of it is realizing just how much value there is in your existing network and making sure that you're reinvesting in that and reaffirming those relationships, particularly as we go back to being able to have face-to-face conversations, that we need to really reinvest in reconnecting and strengthening our existing networks.
Interesting. So this may be a tough question for you to answer, but given that women seem to be set up to more naturally navigate a situation like the one we're in currently, does this create an opportunity for women to sort of catch up in spots to men? It's funny. I think in normal life, what I've heard many times over the course of my career is how difficult it can be for women to network in the same way that men do. Being out partying till 2 o'clock in the morning when you're a mom, I think personally, at least in my experience, it's a much harder spot to be in for a woman than it is for a man. And yet that's where a lot of the best relationships and sort of real bonding, I think, has taken place as I've watched people throughout my career. And it's not that they're talking about work, it's like they're just hanging out, becoming friends. Is this an opportunity for women to sort of catch up in I guess the network competition?
Oh, it is a hard question, right? Because there's so many factors in play. So as you're describing the separation that women have, we know that that's also an enduring defining characteristic of women's networks, is that their social circles and their professional lives actually tend to be far more segmented than men's. And this has been true for decades. So exactly what you described, like women are much less likely to be going out to the bar right after work because they have other obligations, and perhaps also they don't want to be going out, but there are also social prohibitions, right? In the sense that, is this an appropriate interaction for a man and a woman to be having together? All of that is in play. Historically, that separation has provided some benefits in terms of work-life balance for women, but it's meant that women have to effectively network twice as hard to get the same outcomes because they're maintaining two separate networks, their professional life and their social life. There's some benefits to being more virtual. So part of it is that there's a reduction in the prohibition. There's lots of statistics showing that a surprising number of people think it's even inappropriate for a man and a woman to have a work lunch together without someone else present. So that ability and that tension is no longer there, right? When you're virtual,
Right.
we know that actually the studies that have looked at interactions on LinkedIn and other platforms show that interactions on online platforms do tend to be more diverse than they are face-to-face. And also in online forums, that women have an easier ability to speak up. So even physical height has a huge impact on how much someone's speaking in their leadership, their likelihood of ascending to a leadership position. And all of that kind of is diminished online. But at the same time, our ability to connect and form meaningful relationships virtually is still more difficult than it is face to face. So I think there's some benefits of this. And the hope, I think, is for both employees and employers to think about what benefits can we focus on and keep while keeping in mind, right, it's not a panacea and it's not going to solve this really enduring social problem.
So that's a good point, I think, to segue into talking about what could companies do to educate their employees around all of these issues, and how can companies implement programs that are more intentional about these issues so that we all just get better at it. I mean, when I think about iConnections, our entire business is around convening our industry together. So how can we be better at it, more intentional, and use these concepts to form stronger groups internally and get more, I'll call it network effect, I guess, outside of our organization into the industry? How would a company go about like kind of taking the first step into this area?
I love that. It's such a great question. And you guys are really thought leaders on doing this well. So I would also love to hear your thoughts on this. But if we think about in general, what normally happens or what I would see, I'll start with the biggest mistakes. And I think the biggest mistakes is there's often this kind of like, build it and they will come, right? Like it'll just work out. If we get everyone in the same room, it'll just work out. Let's have a cocktail party or a Christmas party and people just show up and somehow right? We're going to form better informal networks. And we know from a lot of research that that just simply isn't true. An extreme version of this is the open office space, right? The idea behind open office spaces, right, is we just need more casual collisions, people bump into each other, there'll be innovation and creativity. And none of those, right? We have huge cathedrals built in Silicon Valley, and none of it's based on evidence. That idea that just more interaction is better is just simply wrong. And so to start to move away from that, what I would argue is you need to start to think, one, more carefully about how do you adopt a heterogeneity in preferences. We, particularly during the pandemic, realized people had very different preferences about would they prefer to connect in small groups? Do they really thrive on meeting new people and trying to create circumstances that allow for very different social preferences to be met and to allow people still to connect? Another key set of universal characteristics or properties that I think that companies can really benefit from keeping in mind are what I refer to as creating structure and safety. So if you think about really what's at the heart or what are the pieces that's at the heart of human connection or creating communities, you're really trying to create trust. And that trust can really be created and accelerated through allowing people to engage in self-disclosure, to see and meet on points of commonality, and particularly focus on uncommon commonalities, particularly careful, right? So moving beyond just surface level commonalities, but what do we have in common? What do we share? What do we hope to achieve? And allowing people to see different parts of ourselves. But to do that well, you need structured interaction. So I love how you're describing doing a fundraiser for a common cause or for a common purpose, inviting a speaker in to introduce new ideas. Maybe it's about art history or things that you don't normally talk about, so that everyone is a part of that discussion on even ground and that they feel that they can participate. That's the structure part. The safety part is creating a space where people feel that they can disclose aspects of themselves, that I'm willing to share a part of my identity or my history, but in a way that's comfortable for you, right? We don't want people to show all of themselves or bring all of themselves to work necessarily, but you need to create it in a space that allows people to self-disclose aspects of themselves that will allow for that common connection, but in a way that feels safe.
And I assume that for the leadership in an organization, modeling that kind of behavior, I would assume, especially making it safe for people, is probably really critical to help just drive buy-in to the process and get people comfortable with sharing.
Absolutely. I mean, in many ways, it has to start with leadership because they're creating that safe space or the container, and the people are really going to look to them about what's appropriate. And one of the norms has to be that leadership is modeling is that within this space, right, that there is no fear of reprisal or fear of judgment. And that's really key. And in many ways, only leadership can set the tone for making that happen.
Can you give us an example of a company or an organization that you've worked with where you've helped them build out their networking capabilities, or help them build their networks more intentionally? Can you give us a real world example?
Sure. I spend a lot of time thinking about healthcare and working in healthcare organizations in many ways because I think that those are some of the more complex or thornier places to work. And so one of the things that was most powerful to me was that during COVID, I was working with the emergency department in a large hospital, trying to understand how do we help reduce stress? How do we reduce burnout during the midst of a significant crisis? And oftentimes the solutions that companies come up with for addressing issues around stress or burnout are often focused on individual level problems. So thinking about, all right, take more, meditate, or you need to invest more in your own personal well-being. But what we found when in working in the emergency department is actually one of the best protectors or one of the best ways of helping stave off stress and burnout turned to be a strong team identification. So, and what was really critical there is it shifts the way of thinking about the problem from the individual to the community. So how can we investing in the team rather than asking individuals to assume more responsibility at a time when they had so little bandwidth? And in other healthcare settings, I really delved into trying to understand what makes for a great team. And by starting to address that either through wearable sensors to understand what do these team dynamics look like, How can we improve listening behavior? How can we increase psychological safety? All that improves team performance. And it turned out in this case that creating these effective networks that allow for higher team identification was really critical to helping this emergency department do well during the midst of COVID.
Interesting. How do you measure the effectiveness? Like, how do you know if you're getting better at this?
I mean, I appreciate that because measurement, right? In my line of business, measurement is so important. So in part, we can think about within, as an individual, you can map your own network. So I have a free network assessment, assessing your network, that you can look at your own network and see how that's changing over time. That same idea can be applied within companies. So what I do in most of my research is actually create maps, and those maps, right, you can think of as constellations or maps that tell you how well is this team functioning, how well is this organization functioning. And then by looking at that over time, you can see, all right, what seems to be working, how is this network evolving, and then mapping it to outcomes, whether it's burnout, stress, resilience, organizational performance, profit, whatever it may be. But it really, in measuring it is key. But one of the pieces like that I also try to keep in mind is, right, if you're working in a team, it's really difficult to measure on a day-to-day basis. Like, what does our network look like, right? But there are behavioral cues, as we got back to before, that are good signals of this. So how much are people interrupting? How much time are people listening? What's the equality in turn taking? For instance, we know that how equal turn taking is. I can take that measurement and it's very predictive of what your network looks like. So we can also look for these behavioral cues that are our network signatures.
That's interesting. In our, as we're approaching the end of our time here, there's one concept that I really want you to touch on that I thought was especially fascinating, and it's the liking gap. Can you tell us what that is and how we all struggle with it, apparently?
I struggle with this. So it's one of my favorite topics of conversation. So one of the peculiarities, right? If we think about where we actually started this conversation, or what are one of the biggest impediments to building an effective network, it's actually oftentimes self-confidence or feeling like we don't know how to do this really well. Social interaction is one of the curious domains of human interaction, that if you ask people how good of a driver they are, if you ask them how smart they are, most people will tend to tell you they're better at average at most things. But social interaction is one of the few domains in which we routinely think that we're worse than average. So we think other people have more friends than we do. And another manifestation of this is the liking gap that you referenced. So if you've ever been in a conversation and you've left that conversation like kind of cringing, like, oh my God, I'm not sure how I came off, or like, did I really say that? You have experienced the liking gap. And this was first identified by Erica Boothby. And what she did was she put people in conversations, both in the lab and outside the lab, and asked both people how they think that the conversation went. And people consistently underestimated how much their conversational partner enjoyed the conversation. So this is the liking gap. And it's really important because if we're always underestimating how well we're doing in a conversation, or we're always kind of hard on ourselves or second guessing, did that go well? It really impedes our ability to connect. And one of the things that I hope to draw attention to first is that we're all better at this, far better at this than we think. So people like you more than they think you do. But also confidence is such a key role. And what I hope to do in a lot of my work is by getting basic pieces of information. One of the best, for instance, things you can do in a conversation is ask a follow-up question. Listening is extraordinarily powerful. By starting to understand these really basic tools, it oftentimes increases people's confidence. And that change in confidence oftentimes is really key, not just in terms of building a more effective network, but more importantly, actually just enjoying social interaction, which we all have to have on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I thought one of the things that you mentioned in the book that was fascinating was when you walk into a room, it's good to, as if you assume you're by yourself, you don't know anyone in the room, scan the room and pick the odd numbered groups. And that's a good starting point because you become a natural addition, since we all tend to sort of talk in pairs. So someone isn't paired up in that odd number group. So you've got a better chance of sort of entering that group because of that fact. I've never thought about that before, but it makes complete sense.
And it's so basic, right? If you think about studying network science and applying it, it's actually the most basic principle that we know that most human interaction happens in dyads, groups of two. And by starting to apply, this is a great example by starting to apply this really basic intuition and understanding of how social systems work, that it makes it much easier actually to engage socially. And it also increases confidence. I know for me, like when I started applying this, every cocktail party or like every forced social event became a little bit more palatable, because I'm like, right, at least I don't either just have to run out the door, like head for the bar as fast as I can. Like I've got some sort of strategy in mind.
That makes complete sense. Well, Marissa, this was great. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I would love to have you come and speak to our, hopefully a couple thousand people at our flagship event in January of next year, when hopefully we'll all be able to do this again physically.
It would be my pleasure. It's always fun to reconnect.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Marissa. We appreciate your support of our International Women's Day event. And for everyone else, pick up a copy of Marissa's book, Social Chemistry: Decoding the Patterns of Human Connection by Marissa King. Thank you so much for joining us.